I had taken up the job as a security guard at the quiet college campus in California to pay my way through grad school. Working the night shift had its advantages, peace and solitude, or so I thought. Little did I know that it would also become the source of the most harrowing experience of my life. It was a chilly autumn night, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting an eerie shadow over the empty campus. My duty was simple: patrol the campus, ensure everything was secure, and report any unusual incidents over the security radio. As I strolled across the dimly lit paths, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't help but feel as though I was being watched, and it wasn't just the typical paranoia that crept in during the lonely hours of the night. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued my patrol, making my way to the main administration building. As I passed by a cluster of trees, my radio crackled to life, causing me to jump in surprise. "Security, come in," a voice hissed over the radio. It was distorted, as if someone was speaking through a voice changer. "Who's this?" I responded, my heart racing. The voice on the other end was chillingly calm. "I'm watching you." I swept the area with my flashlight, but the darkness revealed nothing. "Who is this?" "This isn't funny." A sinister laugh echoed through the radio. "Oh, it's no joke. I know you're there, patrolling all alone. Just you and me." My blood ran cold. This was no ordinary prank. Someone was taunting me, and they knew my every move. Panic set in, and I hastily pressed the panic button on my radio, alerting the campus police. "Stay on the line," I heard a dispatcher say. "We're sending someone over." But the eerie voice on the other end continued, unfazed. "You can call for help, but no one can save you now. You're alone in the dark, and I'm right here with you." I frantically scanned the area, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There was no one in sight, and yet the voice seemed so close, as though it were whispering directly into my ear. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, snapping me back to reality. "Security, officers are on their way. Stay alert." I nodded, though I had no intention of remaining stationary. I needed to get to the administration building, where I could lock myself in and wait for the police. As I hurried along the winding path, the voice continued to torment me. It seemed to know every detail of my route, every step I took. It spoke of my deepest fears, my insecurities, as though it had been watching me for a lifetime. Finally, I reached the administration building and bolted the heavy door behind me. My hands were trembling, and sweat coated my brow. I radioed the dispatcher, informing them of my location and that I was now safe inside. But the voice on the other end didn't seem deterred. "You can lock the doors, but you can't hide forever. I'll find you, just like I've found all the others." Dread settled in my chest as I listened to the ominous threats. Who was this stalker, and why had they singled me out? The minutes ticked by like hours as I waited for the police to arrive, the voice growing quieter but never entirely fading away. When the officers finally arrived, they searched the campus thoroughly, but there was no sign of the stalker. They assured me they would increase patrols and investigate the incident, but the fear remained. Over the following nights, the taunting voice returned sporadically, each time more malevolent than the last. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that this faceless tormentor was lurking just out of sight. I never discovered the identity of the stalker, and the haunting incidents eventually ceased. But the scars they left behind, the fear, the paranoia, the knowledge that I was never truly alone, still haunt me to this day. Let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I had always been a creature of the night. So when I landed a night shift job at a post office in the heart of New York City, I thought I had found the perfect fit. Working the graveyard shift had its perks: no unbearable daytime traffic, less hustle and bustle, and the chance to enjoy the quiet, mystical side of the city that never sleeps. One brisk autumn evening, with the streets eerily deserted, I found myself alone in the dimly lit sorting room, the hum of the machinery the only sound. That's when I stumbled upon it, a package unlike any I had ever seen before. It was a nondescript cardboard box, seemingly ordinary. But the absence of a return address was the first red flag. I picked it up, my gloved hands trembling. The box bore strange, intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I couldn't make sense of them, and the longer I stared, the more unsettling they became. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to inspect the contents of the package. After all, it was my job to ensure the safety of all mail. With a cautious slice of my box cutter, I peeled back the cardboard flaps, revealing what lay within. Nestled inside was a cluster of dried, withered flowers. They were unlike any I had ever seen, deep crimson, their petals paper-thin and brittle. An unsettling scent, like decay and mildew, wafted from the box, filling the room with an eerie aroma that made my stomach churn. I plucked the flowers from the box, and beneath them, I found an old, weathered diary. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the leather cover was cracked and worn. A quick flip through the diary revealed pages filled with cryptic writings in a language I couldn't decipher. The ink appeared to shimmer, as though it were still wet. As I delved deeper into the diary, I began to sense an inexplicable connection between myself and its enigmatic contents. It was as if the words on the page were reaching out to me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. The more I read, the more I felt as though I were being drawn into a sinister web, one that had been woven long before my time. Hours passed, the night outside plunging into the darkest depths of oblivion. I couldn't tear myself away from the diary. Its stories told of rituals, of summoning forces beyond human comprehension, of promises made to entities that dwelled in the shadows. A bone-chilling draft swept through the sorting room, extinguishing the overhead lights and plunging me into an inky abyss. Panic gripped me, but I couldn't look away from the diary. I felt a presence in the room, an insidious force that seemed to encircle me. From the darkness emerged a whisper, a voice that slithered through my mind like a serpent. "You have opened the door," it hissed, the words forming in my mind rather than through my ears. "Now, you must face the consequences." I dropped the diary, the thud echoing through the silent room. Desperation clawed at me as I fumbled for my phone, the pale glow of the screen my only source of comfort. But even as I dialed 911, I knew it was too late. The line crackled to life, but the voice that emanated from the other end was not that of a dispatcher. It was a chorus of whispers, unintelligible and maddening. Panic surged through me as I hung up, my heart racing. Suddenly, the room was filled with an unholy light, the symbols on the box and in the diary glowing with an eerie radiance. The very air seemed to hum with malevolence, and I knew I had become ensnared in something far beyond my comprehension. I fled the sorting room, the chilling presence at my heels. The building seemed to twist and contort around me, the walls closing in as though they were alive. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, but I was not alone. I reached the main entrance, flinging the doors open, and stumbled out into the cool night air. The city streets were a maze of shadow and neon, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The package, the diary, the sinister whispers, they had all become a part of me. As the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, I knew that I would never be free of the darkness that had consumed me. The package had been a gateway, and I had foolishly crossed the threshold. I was forever bound to the enigmatic forces that lurked in the shadows of New York City, condemned to wander the night, a mere pawn in a game far beyond my control. The wind whispered secrets through the dense forests of Whispering Pines, West Virginia, as I made my way to the small, remote hospital nestled amidst the trees. It was my first night shift as a nurse, and despite the chill in the air, a nervous sweat clung to my brow. I'd heard stories about this place, stories of strange occurrences and eerie happenings that sent shivers down my spine. As I stepped into the dimly lit hospital, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced on the sterile, white walls. I couldn't help but feel like I'd entered a world of uncertainty, a world where reality blurred at the edges. The night shift was slow to start, with only a few patients scattered across the dimly lit wards. Their moans and cries seemed to resonate with the creaking of the old building, creating a dissonant symphony that sent a chill down my spine. My first patient was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with frail bones and rheumy eyes. She clutched my hand with a strength that belied her age, her voice barely above a whisper as she muttered about shadows and figures that lurked in the corners of her room. I assured her it was just her imagination, but her grip tightened, and her eyes held a haunting fear that sent shivers down my spine. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Patients spoke of the whispers that echoed through the halls at night, the hushed conversations of figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. I tried to dismiss their tales as the ramblings of the ill, but their stories were too consistent, too chillingly similar. In room 213, Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a broken leg, beckoned me closer. His voice quivered as he recounted how he'd been awoken by a shadowy figure that had leaned over his bed, its face hidden in the darkness. I peered into the dimly lit room, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Then there was Sarah, a young girl with a heart condition, who insisted that a woman in a white gown visited her each night, whispering promises of a painless end to her suffering. It was as if the hospital itself had become a breeding ground for despair, a place where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred with every passing hour. As the night wore on, I found myself moving cautiously through the corridors, my footsteps muffled by the thick, old carpet. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced as I rounded a corner and came face to face with a figure in a tattered hospital gown. I stumbled back in shock, my breath catching in my throat. The figure's hollow eyes fixed on me, and a haunting smile curled its lips. It was Nurse Thompson, the woman who had trained me earlier that day. But something was horribly wrong. Her once kind eyes were now devoid of emotion, her voice a chilling monotone as she whispered incomprehensible words. I retreated, my heart pounding, and sought out the hospital's records room. The dusty shelves were filled with old patient files, some dating back decades. As I scanned the records, I noticed a disturbing pattern. The patients who had spoken of shadows and figures had all met the same fate. They had disappeared without a trace, their files marked as transferred. A cold sweat clung to my skin as I realized the truth. There was something deeply wrong with Whispering Pines Hospital, something sinister that lurked in the shadows. The figures that haunted the halls, the whispers that echoed through the night, they were all part of a malevolent force that fed on the despair of the patients. I knew I had to escape, to flee the hospital before it claimed me too. But as I made my way back to the exit, the lights overhead flickered and died, plunging the hospital into darkness. The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible but undeniably malevolent. In the pitch-black corridors, I felt unseen eyes upon me, and I knew I was not alone. The figures, the shadows, were closing in, and there was nowhere to run. My heart raced, and I whispered a desperate prayer that someone, somewhere, would hear me. Whispering Pines had claimed many souls, and it hungered for one more. It was an oppressively hot summer night in Ohio, and I found myself perched in the control room of the aging power plant that had been my workplace for the last decade. The hum of the generators filled the air as I monitored the labyrinth of gauges and switches, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. It was a thankless job, but it paid the bills. The night shift had always been eerily quiet, with only the occasional chirping of crickets breaking the silence. Tonight, however, there was a sense of unease in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that set my nerves on edge. As I continued to scan the control panels, a flicker on one of the screens caught my eye. It was a sudden drop in power output, a glitch that should never happen in a facility as well maintained as ours. I checked the gauges, trying to pinpoint the issue, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No alarms, no flashing lights, just a creeping sense of unease. I radioed my colleague, Jerry, who was on the other side of the plant. His voice crackled through the static, and I could hear the confusion in his tone as he reported a similar drop in power. It was as if the electricity itself had decided to abandon us. We decided to meet at the main generator to assess the situation together. The control room was plunged into darkness as I made my way through the labyrinthine corridors, guided only by the feeble beam of my flashlight. The emergency lights were supposed to kick in automatically during a power outage, but they remained stubbornly off. When I reached the generator room, Jerry was already there, his flashlight illuminating the massive turbines that loomed like silent giants. We exchanged uneasy glances, the silence weighing heavy on our shoulders. It was then that I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. We tried to radio the rest of the team, but all we got was static. It was as if we were cut off from the outside world. Panic began to creep in as we realized the gravity of our situation. We were alone in the heart of a dead power plant, surrounded by machinery that should never fail. As we continued to investigate, our flashlights revealed something that sent shivers down our spines, strange symbols etched into the walls and floor, symbols that neither of us recognized. They glowed with an eerie, bluish light, casting long, grotesque shadows on the metal surfaces. Jerry's voice quivered as he whispered, "What the hell is going on here, man?" I had no answer. Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind as I looked around, feeling as though we were being watched. The symbols seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the temperature continued to drop. Suddenly, we heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was unintelligible, like the voices of the wind itself, but it filled the room, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if the very air was trying to communicate with us, to convey some ancient, incomprehensible message. Jerry and I exchanged terrified glances, our instincts screaming at us to run, to flee from whatever unseen force surrounded us. But the symbols on the walls seemed to come alive, their eerie glow intensifying as the whispering voices grew louder. In a moment of sheer terror, we stumbled back toward the exit, our flashlights swinging wildly in the darkness. The symbols seemed to writhe and contort, and the whispering became a cacophony of voices, a symphony of madness that threatened to engulf us. We burst out of the generator room and into the dimly lit corridor, our hearts pounding in our chests. The emergency lights had flickered to life, casting an eerie red glow that seemed to accentuate the shadows lurking in every corner. We didn't look back. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls, the whispers fading into the distance. When we finally burst out into the night air, gasping for breath, the power plant was plunged into darkness once more, as if the entire ordeal had never happened. We never spoke of that night again, and we never returned to that cursed place. But the symbols, the voices, and the palpable sense of malevolence still haunt my dreams, a reminder that there are forces in this world that defy explanation, forces that exist in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those unlucky enough to stumble upon them. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a horror story, especially in a place as mundane as a high-rise office building in the heart of Chicago. I was the night shift security guard, a job that usually consisted of watching cameras and making sure the building was secure. But one fateful night, the ordinary turned into something out of a nightmare. It was around 2 a.m. when the call came in from the 10th floor. One of the employees had left something in their office and needed access to the building. I obliged, as it wasn't uncommon for late-night workers to forget their access cards. I took the elevator up, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. The 10th floor was deserted as expected, but the employee's office was at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. I swiped my card to unlock the door, and they thanked me before disappearing into the office. I waited for them to retrieve their belongings, my eyes wandering to the elevator at the other end of the hall. The elevator doors slid shut with a mechanical hiss, leaving me alone in the dimly lit corridor. As the seconds ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The elevator should have returned to the ground floor by now, but it remained stubbornly on the 10th floor. I walked over and pressed the button to call it back down, but there was no response. I could hear the faint hum of the machinery, but the elevator remained immobile. I reached for my radio to call for help, but it emitted nothing but static. Panic began to well up inside me. I was trapped in the elevator, and my only lifeline to the outside world had been cut. I hit the emergency button repeatedly, but there was no response. Sweat began to bead on my forehead as I contemplated my options. I knew I had to stay calm. I had to wait for someone to notice I was missing and come looking for me. But as the minutes turned into hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was truly alone, abandoned in the elevator. That's when the whispers began. At first, they were so faint that I thought they were a product of my imagination, a result of the anxiety coursing through my veins. But as I strained to listen, I realized they were real, disembodied voices that seemed to come from all around me. The voices were hushed, their words unintelligible, but their presence was suffocating. It was as if a dozen people were whispering right into my ears, their breath hot and moist against my skin. I shivered and pressed myself against the cold, metal walls of the elevator, desperate to escape the relentless murmurs. Hours passed, and I lost all sense of time. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of sound that threatened to drive me to madness. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, but it was no use. The voices persisted, a ceaseless chorus of torment. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my own ragged breaths. I cautiously opened my eyes and looked around, but the elevator was empty, as it had always been. With trembling hands, I reached for the emergency button once more, and this time, miraculously, it worked. The elevator jolted to life, descending to the ground floor with a sickening lurch. I stumbled out as soon as the doors opened, my heart pounding in my chest. I never spoke of that night to anyone. I resigned from my job and tried to put it all behind me, but the memory of those unsettling whispers still haunts my nightmares. I don't know what happened in that elevator, but I know one thing for certain. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves.